On a desolate beach in Corinth, years after the legends had been written, an old, broken man sat beneath the rotting hull of a once great ship. The timber, bleached by the sun and eaten by salt, was all that remained of the Argo, the vessel that had conquered the known world. The man was Jason, the hero whose name had once echoed louder than the thunder of Zeus. But history often remembers only the glory, the shimmering Golden Fleece, the sleeping dragon, and the impossible voyage. History conveniently forgets the cost. This is not merely a fairy tale of adventure. It is a tragedy of ambition, a blood-soaked alliance with dark magic, and a lesson on how a hero can lose his soul in pursuit of a crown. Before the sails were hoisted, before Hercules lifted his club, and before the witch Medea cast her first spell, it all began with a simple, terrifying prophecy that made a tyrant tremble on his throne. Beware the man who comes wearing only one sandal. To understand why 50 of the greatest heroes in Greek mythology were willing to sail to the edge of the world and face certain death, we must first look into the corrupted heart of the kingdom of Io. There, King Pelias sat upon a throne he had stolen. He was a usurper, a man who had seized power by overthrowing his rightful half-brother, Eson, and slaughtering anyone who dared to oppose him. But like all tyrants who build their castles on foundations of blood, Pelias never knew a night of peace. His mind was consumed by paranoia, fueled by a chilling prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi. The gods had not promised him a death in battle or by old age. Instead, they warned him that his doom would come in the form of a kinsman, a youth, who would enter the city wearing only one sandal. While Pelias ruled with an iron fist, the rightful heir, Jason, was raised in secret, far from the poisonous whispers of the court. Hidden away on the rugged slopes of Mount Pelion, he was educated by Chiron, the wise and ancient centaur who had trained legends like Achilles. Chiron did not just teach Jason the art of the sword and the spear. He taught him statecraft, honor, and the heavy burden of leadership. For 20 years, Jason grew in strength and beauty, unaware that he was being forged into a weapon against his own uncle. When he finally came of age, the truth of his heritage was revealed, and he set out for Iolcos to claim his birthright, not with an army, but with the confidence of youth, the hand of destiny. Perhaps the manipulation of the goddess Hera, who hated Pelias, intervened before Jason even reached the city gates. While crossing the turbulent river Anaros, Jason stopped to help an old crone across the raging waters. The current was strong, and the mud was thick. In the struggle to carry the woman to the other bank, he lost one of his sandals in the silt. He did not know that the old woman was Hera in disguise, testing his character. He only knew that he had to continue his journey barefoot on one side. When Jason finally entered the marketplace of Iolcos, a hush fell over the crowd. He was a striking figure, holding 2 spears and dressed in the skin of a leopard, but the eyes of the people were drawn to his feet. Word reached the palace instantly. King Pelias rushed out on his chariots to confront the stranger, and when he looked down, his blood ran cold. The nightmare had arrived. The prophecy was real. However, the laws of hospitality and the presence of the public prevented Pelias from killing Jason on the spot. Instead, a tense, verbal duel ensued. Jason declared his identity and demanded the throne. Pelias, cunning and manipulative, asked the young hero a trap question. What would you do if you were king, and an oracle told you that one of your subjects would kill you? Jason, perhaps inspired by the gods, or simply speaking boldly, replied, I would send him to retrieve the Golden Fleece. Pelias smiled. The Golden Fleece was located in Chalcus, at the furthest end of the world, guarded by a sleepless dragon and a sorcerer king. It was a suicide mission. Then go, Pelias commanded. Bring me the fleece, and the kingdom is yours. The challenge issued by King Pelias was intended to be a death sentence, but Jason transformed it into a call to glory. The quest for the Golden Fleece was not a task for a single man, no matter how skilled. It required a force unlike anything the world had ever seen. Jason sent heralds to every corner of Greece, announcing the voyage. The response was overwhelming. The greatest figures of the age laid down their plows, left their palaces, and paused their wars to answer the call. This was the Avengers of Antiquity, a gathering of demigods, kings, and warriors known as the Argo. Among them stood Hercules, the strongest man in the world, fresh from his labors, wearing the skin of the Nemean lion. There was Orpheus, the musician whose lyre could charm stones and silence storms. The twins, Castor and Pollux, the finest horsemen and boxers, joined the ranks, alongside Pelias, the future father of Achilles, and the father of Ajax. Each man was a hero in his own right, capable of leading an army. Yet they all agreed to serve under the command of young Jason. This dynamic was crucial. Jason was not the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the wisest, but he possessed a charisma that could bind these massive egos together into a single, functioning unit. But a crew of legends needed a vessel worthy of them. Under the guidance of the goddess Athena, a master shipwright named Argus began the construction of the Argo. This was no ordinary fishing boat or merchant vessel. It was the first longship of its kind, a 50-oared galley built for speed and endurance. The timber was harvested from the sacred pines of Mount Pelias. In a final act of divine blessing, Athena herself brought a piece of sacred oak from the oracle grove of Dodona and fitted it into the ship's prow. This beam was enchanted. It could speak, offer counsel, and warn the crew of approaching danger. The Argo was more than a machine. It was a living entity, the 51st member of the crew. The day of departure was a spectacle of emotion and ritual. Crowds gathered at the harbor of Pagasae to witness the launch. Sacrifices of bulls were made to Apollo and Poseidon to ensure safe passage. As the heroes took their seats at the benches, a question of leadership arose. The crew initially looked to Hercules, the natural choice due to his divine strength and experience. But Hercules, demonstrating a surprising humility and understanding of destiny, refused the honor. He pointed to Jason, the man whose birthright had sparked this fire. "This is his voyage," Hercules declared. "He shall lead us." With the chain of command established, the oars struck the water in perfect unison. Orpheus struck a rhythm on his lyre to keep time, transforming the brute force of 50 men into a synchronized engine of war. The Argo sliced through the waves, leaving the safety of the harbor behind. As the coast of Greece faded into the mist, the reality of their undertaking settled in. They were sailing off the edge of the known map, into waters filled with monsters, magic, and the unknown. They were sailing toward immortality, but few realized that immortality is often bought with blood. The first true test of the Argonauts did not come in the form of a sea monster or a violent storm. It came in the form of a temptation so sweet it nearly ended the quest before it truly began. After days of sailing, the Argo approached the island of Lemnos. From Tedek, the heroes could see smoke rising from the fires of a bustling city. They prepared their weapons, tightening their grip on spears and shields, expecting a hostile reception. What they found instead was silence, followed by a welcome that was unnervingly warm. Lemnos was an island entirely inhabited by women. Years prior, the women of Lemnos had been cursed by the goddess Aphrodite for neglecting her worship. The curse caused them to emit a foul odor, driving their husbands into the arms of captive women from Thrace. Enraged by this betrayal, the women of Lemnos committed an act of unthinkable brutality in one blood-soaked night. They murdered every male on the island, husbands, fathers, and sons. By the time the Argonauts arrived, the curse of the smell had lifted, but the guilt and loneliness remained. They were a society of warrior queens, ruled by the young Hypsipyle, desperate for new blood to prevent their race from dying out. When Jason and his crew stepped ashore, they were not met with swords, but with feasts, wine, and open arms. The women of Lemnos saw the arrival of the strongest men in Greece as a gift from the gods. Queen Hypsipyle immediately took a liking to Jason, offering him not just her bed, but her throne. She wove a lie to explain the absence of men, claiming they had been exiled, sparing Jason the gruesome truth of the massacre. For the Argonauts, tired from the sea, this seemed like paradise. The mission for the Golden Fleece began to feel like a distant, foolish dream. Why risk death in the east when they could live like kings here? Days turned into weeks, and weeks threatened to turn into months. The Argo sat anchored in the harbor, its wood beginning to dry and crack from neglect. The heroes grew soft, trading their armor for silken robes, and their oars for wine goblets. Jason, comfortably installed in the palace, seemed to have forgotten the usurper Pelias and the promise of his kingdom. The greatest danger to a hero, it turns out, is not a monster that wants to kill him, but a life that makes him forget who he is. It was Hercules who finally shattered the illusion. The mighty demigod had remained by the ship, refusing to partake in the domestic comforts of the island. He stormed into the city, his voice booming through the halls of the palace. He shamed the crew, calling them cowards who were content to be breeding stock for a nation of Did we leave our homes to become farmers on a foreign rock? He roared. Or did we come to win glory? His words cut through the haze of pleasure, shamed and sobered. Jason realized the depth of his distraction. With heavy hearts, the Argonauts said their goodbyes to the women of Lemnos. As the sails caught the wind once more, they learned their first valuable lesson. The path to greatness is lined with distractions, and comfort is the enemy of destiny. The voyage of the Argo was never meant to be easy, but the crew had always taken comfort in one undeniable fact: they had Hercules. With the son of Zeus on their benches, no monster seemed insurmountable. If a Hydra appeared, Hercules would crush it. If an army attacked, Hercules would break their lines. He was their battering ram, their safety net. But destiny has a cruel way of leveling the playing field. To forge a true leader out of Jason, the gods had to strip him of his greatest protector. The separation began not with a battle, but with a broken piece of wood. As the Argo sailed through the Propontis, the sheer power of Hercules proved to be a liability. In a contest of rowing endurance, he pulled his oar with such savage force that the timber snapped in half. Needing to fashion a new one, the crew made landfall on the coast of Chios. It was a peaceful, verdant place, teeming with fresh water and game. While Hercules ventured deep into the woods to uproot a tree, his young squire and beloved companion, Hylas, went to a nearby spring to fetch water for the evening meal. Hylas was possessed of a beauty that was said to rival the gods, a radiance that captivated mortals and immortals alike. As he dipped his bronze pitcher into the crystal-clear pool of Pega, he was not alone. The Naiads, water nymphs, who dwelt in the spring, were watching. Enraptured by his beauty, they rose from the depths. Just as Hylas leaned forward, a nymph wrapped her pale arm around his neck and pulled him into the water. He let out a single, terrified cry before the surface broke and settled into silence. He was not killed, but he was taken imprisoned in a watery embrace forever, gifted with immortality, but stolen from the world of men. Hercules heard the cry. The panic in Hylas's voice triggered a primal rage in the demigod. He abandoned his task, dropping the massive tree he had up, and tore through the forest like a wild beast, screaming Hylas's name. He questioned every shadow, overturned boulders, and terrified the local Mysians, but the forest offered no answers. The sun set, and the moon rose, but Hercules did not return to the ship. He was lost in his grief, wandering deeper into the wilderness. Back on the beach, a contentious debate erupted among the Argonauts. The winds had turned favorable, and the mission demanded haste. Jason was paralyzed by indecision, but the other crew members argued that they could not wait forever. In the confusion of the pre-dawn light, the order was given to cast off. It was only when they were miles out to sea that they realized they had left the strongest man in the world behind. Accusations flew. Telamon, a close friend of Hercules, nearly drew his sword on Jason, accusing him of abandoning a rival. Sobered by the loss of Hercules, the Argonauts arrived at the gloomy shores of Samodesus in The coastline was jagged, battered by gray waves, reflecting the misery of the land's ruler. They had come seeking supplies, but they found a kingdom living under a divine curse. The king was Phineus, a man who had once been a great prophet. However, he had committed the sin of revealing too much of the gods' plans to mankind. For this transgression, Zeus had blinded him and condemned him to a torture worse than death, eternal starvation amidst a banquet. When Jason and his crew entered the palace, they found Phineus withered to skin and bone, a living skeleton sitting before a table laden with sumptuous food. The moment the old man reached for a piece of bread, a screeching noise tore through the air. From the clouds descended the Harpies, the hounds of Zeus. These were monstrous hybrids with the bodies of vultures and the faces of pale, starving women. They did not kill Phineus. They did something crueler. They swooped down, snatched the food from his hands, and defiled what remained with a stench so putrid that no human could stand to be near it. Phineus was left weeping, hungry, and covered in filth. This was a horror unlike anything the heroes had faced. It was not a physical fight, it was a spiritual violation, but the Argo carried a specific countermeasure for this curse. Among the crew were Zeus, and Calais, the Bereds, sons of the North Wind. They were winged heroes, capable of flight. As the Harpies descended for their next raid, the Bereds drew their swords and launched themselves into the air. A spectacular aerial dogfight ensued, a chase that spanned across the heavens until the goddess Iris intervened, promising that the Harpies would never bother Phineus again if the Bereds spared their lives. Grateful for his salvation, the blind prophet offered Jason a gift more valuable than gold. He revealed the path ahead. Phineus sat by the fire, his voice trembling as he spoke of the Symplegades, the clashing rocks. He described a narrow, straight where two massive cliffs crashed together continuously, pulverized anything that tried to pass between them. No ship had ever survived the passage. "You must release a dove," Phineus warned, his blind eyes staring into a terrifying future. "If the dove flies through and survives, row with all your might. But if the bird is crushed, turn back, for if the dove fails, not even the gods can save you." The prophecy cast a long shadow over the crew. They realized that their strength, their swords, and their lineage meant nothing against the crushing weight of nature. They were heading into a trap that had no key, armed only with a bird and a prayer. The foreshadowing was clear. The era of easy victories was over. The real gauntlet was about to begin. The prophecy of the blind King Phineus hung heavy over the crew of the Argo as the sound of the ocean changed. The rhythmic lapping of waves against the hull was replaced by a deep, thunderous booming that shook the marrow of their bones. Ahead of them lay the Bosporus Strait, the gateway to the hostile Black Sea. Standing sentinel at this gate were the Symplegades, the clashing rocks. These were not merely geological formations. They were ancient, kinetic deities, massive cliffs of blue stone that drifted apart, only to smash together with the force of an earthquake, pulverizing anything foolish enough to be caught in the middle. The sea churned with white foam, boiling from the violence of the impact. The air was thick with the mist of pulverized water and the roar of stone against stone. Jason stood at the prow, holding a trembling white dove in his hands. The crew stopped rowing, resting on their oars, their eyes fixed on the terrifying rhythm of the rocks. Crash separation. Crash separation. It was a mechanical jaw, chewing the sea. Following Phineus's instructions, Jason waited for the rocks to recoil, creating a narrow channel of open water. With a prayer to Athena, he released the dove. The bird flew straight into the misty gap. The Argonauts held their breath as the cliffs began to close in again, a shadow falling over the water. The rocks slammed shut with a deafening crack that sent a shockwave through the air. For a moment, it seemed the bird was lost, but as the stones receded, the dove was seen flying out the other side, unharmed save for a few tail feathers sheared off by the closing walls. "Now, row!" Jason screamed, his voice cracking against the roar. The 50 heroes of Greece drove their oars into the water with a fury born of terror. The Argo surged forward, leaping into the gap like a spear. The cliffs, sensing the intrusion, began to close once more. It was a race against the mountain itself. The water in the channel rose in a massive crest, a tsunami created by the displacement of the rocks, threatening to swamp the ship. The oars bent under the strain. The walls of blue stone loomed over them, blotting out the sky, closing in to crush the wooden shell of the ship. In the final second, as the prow cleared the exit, the stern was still in danger. It is said that Athena herself, watching from the clouds, reached down with one hand to hold back the rock, and with the other to push the ship forward. The Argo shot out into the open waters of the Black Sea, just as the Symplegades slammed shut behind them, shearing off the ornamental stern ornament. The impact was final. According to the laws of the fates, once a ship had passed through safely, the rocks were destined to stop moving forever. The Argonauts had not just survived, they had frozen the jaws of the sea, opening the path for all future navigation. But as they looked out at the dark, stormy expanse of the Pontus Euxine, they realized that escaping the rocks was only the beginning. They were now locked in a world where the rules of Greece did not apply. The Black Sea was not like the Mediterranean. The waters were darker, the storms more violent, and the coastlines were inhabited by tribes that defied civilized description. The Argo was now sailing along the northern coast of modern-day Turkey, a region known as the Inhospitable Sea. Paranoia began to set in. the heroes were far from the protection of their familiar gods. Every time they made landfall to rest or forage, they risked an encounter with death. Their journey took them past the lands of the Amazons, the legendary warrior women who were daughters of Ares, the god of war. These were not the welcoming women of Lemnos. The Amazons were fierce, brutal, and hated men. Knowing that a battle with them would likely result in heavy casualties and delay the quest, Jason ordered the crew to catch the wind and sail past their territory by night. It was a tense evasion, watching the fires of the Amazon war camps burning on the shore, hearing the beating of drums, and praying the ship remained unseen in the darkness. Forth at east, they encountered the Chalybes, a tribe of ironworkers who knew no agriculture or law. The sky above their land was permanently stained with soot, and the ringing of hammers on anvils echoed across the water day and night. It was an industrial hellscape in the ancient world, a grim reminder that they were moving away from the pastoral beauty of Greece into a harder, colder reality. But the strangest encounter awaited them at the island of Ares. As the Argo approached this small, rocky island, the sky darkened not with clouds, but with wings. They were attacked by the Stymphalian birds, creatures with metallic feathers that could be launched like arrows. These were the same beasts Hercules had once fought. Driven here to the edge of the world, the birds dived, their bronze feathers raining down on the deck, wounding several Argonauts. Swords were useless against an enemy that attacked from above. Remembering the lessons of warfare, the crew devised a tactical solution. They locked their shields together over their heads, creating a testudo or tortoise formation, and beat their spears against the bronze to create a deafening clamor. The noise, amplified by the metal, terrified the birds, driving them away. It was on this desolate island that they found 4 shipwrecked, starving men. These were the sons of Phrixus the man who had originally flown to Chalkis on the Golden Ram generations ago. This meeting was a stroke of fate. These men were grandsons of the king of Chalkis. They knew the layout of the city, the temperament of the king, and the location of the fleece. They warned Jason that King Aedes was not a man to be trifled with. He was a son of Helios, the sun god. The voyage had taken months, costing lives and sanity. But finally, the Argo glided into the broad mouth of the Phasis River. To their left lay the magnificent city of Chalkis, a fortress of towers and golden gates. To their right was the sacred grove of Ares, where the Golden Fleece hung from a massive oak tree, glowing with a supernatural light that illuminated the forest even at night. Coiled around the tree was the sleepless dragon, a beast of immense size with scales that rang like bells. The prize was within reach, but the hand that held it was made of iron. Jason, accompanied by a small delegation including the sons of Phrixus, marched to the palace to demand the fleece. They were met by King Aedes. He was a figure of terrifying majesty, radiating a heat and light that betrayed his divine lineage as the son of the sun. When Jason politely asked for the fleece, citing his divine mission and offering military service in return, Aedes did not laugh. He flew into a rage. He saw these Greeks not as heroes, but as pirates and thieves come to steal his most sacred possession, upon which the prosperity of his kingdom depended. However, the laws of hospitality prevented Aedes from slaughtering guests in his own hall. Instead, he devised a plan to kill Jason legally. He agreed to hand over the Golden Fleece, but only if Jason could prove his worth by completing a trial that Aedes himself claimed to perform routinely. It was a lie, of course. The tasks were designed for a god, not a mortal. "Here is your test," the king declared, his voice dripping with malice. "I have 2 bulls with hooves of bronze and breath of fire. You must yoke them single-handedly. With them, you must plow the field of Ares. Then, you must sow the teeth of a dragon into the furrows. From these teeth, an army of stone warriors the Earthborn will rise, fully armored and thirsting for blood. You must cut them all down before sunset. Do this, and the fleece is yours." The court fell silent. The Argonauts looked at Jason, whose face had gone pale. 2 yoke fire-breathing beasts was impossible. To fight an army that sprang from the ground was suicide. This was not a test of heroism. It was an execution. Aedes dismissed them with a cruel smile, confident that the hero of Greece would be dead by the following noon. But in the shadows of the throne room, unseen by her father, stood the king's daughter, Medea. She was a priestess of Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft. As she watched Jason stand tall against her father's rage, a swift and sudden arrow from Eros, the god of love, struck her heart. She saw his despair, and a dangerous thought took root in her mind. She possessed the dark arts necessary to tame fire and subdue monsters. The conflict was no longer just between Jason and the king. It was a war within Medea's soul, a choice between loyalty to her father and a burning, treasonous love for a stranger. The stage was set for the greatest betrayal in ancient history. The night before the trial, a heavy silence fell over the camp of the Argonauts by the riverbank. Even the greatest heroes of Greecemen who had wrestled lions and outsmarted gods sat with their heads bowed. They knew that valor alone could not save them. King Aeetes had not challenged Jason to a fight, he had sentenced him to an execution. The bulls of Chalkes, known as the Kolketoroi, were gifts from Hephaestus, the smith god. They were machines of living bronze, breathing fire hot enough to melt a shield. To face them was to embrace death. Jason, the leader who had brought them this far, sat apart from his men, staring into the darkness, contemplating a suicidal charge for the sake of honor. But high in the palace towers, a different kind of war was being waged. Medea, the princess and high priestess of Hecate, was tormented by a feverish madness. The arrow of Eros had done its work. She tossed and turned, torn between two sacred duties: obedience to her father, the king, and the overwhelming, supernatural desire to save the stranger with the one sandal. To help Jason was high treason. It meant betraying her blood, her city, and her king. But as dawn approached, Lavore, perhaps obsession, won out. She gathered her herbs in jars, preparing a magic older and darker than anything known in Greece. Under the cover of pre-dawn mist, Jason met Medea at the Temple of Hecate. It was here that the true transaction of the Golden Fleece took place. It was not won by a sword, but by a whisper. Medea offered Jason a jar containing the Promethean charm, an ointment brewed from the flower that grew where the ichor of the tortured titan Prometheus dripped onto the earth. She told him to anoint his body and his weapons with it. For a single day, it would make him invulnerable to fire and iron. He would possess the strength of the gods. In exchange, she demanded a terrible price. "Take me with you. Make me your wife. Do not leave me here to face my father's wrath alone." Jason, desperate and captivated by her power, swore an oath on all the gods of Olympus to marry her. The pact was sealed. When the sun rose, the field of Ares was lined with spectators. King Aeetes sat on his throne, wearing his celestial armor, eager to watch the Greek hero burn. Jason stepped into the arena alone. He had anointed himself with a drug, and his skin glowed with a faint unatura laura. He felt a surge of power coursing through his veins, a hardness in his muscles that felt like stone. Suddenly, the gates opened. The Kolketoroi charged. The ground shook as their bronze hooves tore up the earth. They were nightmare engines, snorting jets of flame that turned the air into a furnace. The Argonauts turned away, unable to watch. The bulls struck Jason with the force of a battering ram, but miraculously, he did not move. He stood like a reef in a stormy sea. The fire washed over him, engulfing his body in a blinding inferno. But the Promethean ointment acted as a shield. The flames licked his skin, but did not burn. The bronze horn struck his chest, but did not pierce. With a roar that matched the beast's, Jason seized the horns of the first bull. Utilizing his borrowed strength, he wrestled the mechanical monster to its knees, forcing its head into the dirt. He did the same to the second. While the beast struggled and spewed smoke, Jason kicked the heavy bronze yoke into place and bound them. The silence in the stadium was deafening. King Aeetes gripped his scepter until his knuckles turned white. He was not watching a hero. He was watching cheat, though he could not prove it. Jason drove the bulls forward, plowing the 4 acres of the field of Ares in a single, grueling afternoon. The iron plowshare ripped through the stony earth, preparing the furrows for the final, gruesome step of the trial. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the overturned soil, Jason unyoked the bulls and slapped their flanks, sending them fleeing back into their dark pens. He had survived the fire. Now, he had to survive the harvest. He reached into the helmet given to him by Aeetes and pulled out the shining, jagged teeth of the dragon. It was time to sow the seeds of death. The sun was setting, casting the field of Ares in a blood-red light. Jason walked along the furrows he had plowed, reaching into the helmet and scattering the dragon's teeth into the fresh earth. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the soil began to ripple. It was not plants that broke the surface, but the tips of spears. Then came bronze helmets, followed by shoulders broad and pale. With a sound like shifting gravel, an entire army of armored warriors, or sown men, clawed their way out of the ground. They were fully formed, born with hatred in their eyes and swords in their hands. They did not need orders. Their only instinct was to kill the sewer. Jason stood frozen. Even with his enchanted strength, he could not fight a battalion single-handedly. He remembered Medea's final instruction. They are children of the earth, mindless and full of rage. Confuse them, and they will destroy themselves. As the Spartoi closed in, tightening their circle, JC grabbed a massive boulder so heavy that for normal men could not lift its hand, hurled it into the center of the mob. The stone crashed into the ranks, knocking several warriors down. The effect was instantaneous. The Spartai, thinking they had been attacked by their own brothers, turned on each other. Chaos erupted. Swords clashed against shields as the stone soldiers began a brutal civil war, hacking each other to pieces in a frenzy of mindless violence. Jason watched from the edge of the field, stepping in only to cut down the few survivors who staggered his way. Within the hour, the harvest was complete. The field was silent again, littered with the broken bodies of the Earthborn. From the high podium, King Aeetes watched in disbelief. His impossible test had been conquered. But he did not applaud. His face twisted into a mask of pure fury. He realized that this was no miracle. It was treachery. Someone had helped the Greek. He swept out of the arena, shouting orders to his generals to prepare the fleet. He planned to massacre the Argonauts in their sleep and burn their ship to the waterline. But Medea was faster. She sprinted to the Argonaut camp, her robes flying, crying out, "You are dead men if you stay. My father knows everything. We must take the fleece and flee this instant." Under the cover of a moonless night, Jason and Medea rushed to the sacred grove of Ares. There, hanging from the great oak tree, was the Golden Fleece. It shone with its own internal light, illuminating the dark forest like a golden lantern. But coiled around the trunk was the guardian, the Colchian dragon. It was a serpent of immense size, with scales that rattled like dry leaves and eyes that never blinked. It hissed as they approached, uncoiling its massive body to strike. Jason drew his sword, but Medea pushed him back. "This is not a fight for steel," she whispered. She stepped forward, chanting a song of sleep in a language older than mankind. She sprinkled a potion made of juniper and poppy juice into the dragon's eyes. The beast swayed. Its head, heavy with magic, began to droop. The unblinking eyes glazed over, and for the first time in centuries, the monster slept. Its jaw hit the forest floor with a heavy thud. Jason scrambled up the coils of the sleeping beast. He reached up and unhooked the Golden Fleece from the branch. It was heavy, thicker than regular wool, and warm to the touch. He threw it over his shoulder, the golden glow casting long shadows through the trees. They ran back to the Argo, where the crew was waiting with oars in hand. "Row!" Jason screamed as he leaped onto the deck, the fleece blazing on his back like a captured star. Medea severed the mooring ropes with a single stroke of her blade. The Argo shot out into the river faces, just as the alarm bells of Colchis began to ring. They had the prize. They had the girl. But behind them, the entire navy of the Sorcerer King was launching into the water. The chase was on. The Golden Fleece was aboard the Argo, glowing beneath the rowing benches, but there was no time to celebrate the victory. The river faces churned with the oars of 100 Chalkean warships. Leading the pursuit was not King Aeetes, who was delayed by age and rage, but his son, Prince Absirus, was a warrior of immense skill and intellect, and he did not merely chase the Greeks, he outmaneuvered them. Instead of following their wake, he cut across the open sea, blockading the mouth of the Danube River. When the Argo arrived, exhausted and battered, they found their escape route sealed. They were trapped between the open ocean and a wall of Colchian steel. Panic gripped the crew. The Argonauts, for all their bravery, were practical men. They began to whisper of a compromise. They would keep the fleece, for Jason had won it fairly, but they would surrender Medea to her brother to buy their safe passage. Medea, hearing these whispers, realized she was about to be traded like cattle. Her love for Jason turned into a cold, terrified survival instinct. She confronted him, not with tears, but with a plan so heinous that even the gods would turn away in disgust. "You swore an oath to me," she hissed. "I gave you the fleece. Now, you must give me my brother." Medea sent a secret message to She played the victim, claiming she had been kidnapped by the barbaric Greeks and wished to return home with the fleece. She arranged a parley on a small, sacred island dedicated to the goddess Artemis. It was holy ground, a place where no blood could be spilled, ensuring Apsyrtus would come alone and unarmed. The prince, trust in his sister and eager to end the standoff without a war, took the bait. He stepped onto the moonlit beach, looking for Medea. He found her standing in the shadows of the temple, but as he reached out to her, the darkness moved. Jason sprang from his hiding place, sword drawn. This was not a duel of heroes. It was an assassination. Before Apsyrtus could draw a breath to scream, Jason struck him down. As the prince fell dying in his sister's arms, he cupped his hands over his wounds and threw his own blood onto Jason's white tunic of final. Dian curse, known as the Erinyes, marking his killer for the Furies. To ensure the destruction of the Colchian pursuit, Jason and Medea did not stop at murder. They committed desecration, in the most gruesome retelling of the tale, to slow down the approaching fleet of King Pelias. They dismembered the body of the prince and scattered his limbs into the ocean. The king, overcome with grief, was forced to stop his ships to collect the pieces of his son for proper burial. The pursuit was broken, not by speed or strategy, but However, the cost of this escape was absolute. As the Argo slipped away into the night, the ship itself began to scream. The sacred beam of Dodona, fitted into the prow, spoke with a human voice, groaning in agony. It declared that Zeus had witnessed the atrocity. They were no longer heroes. They were polluted. The ancient law of miasma blood, guilt clung to them. The weather turned against them. The winds howled in judgment, and the stars seemed to vanish. They had escaped Colchis, but they were now cursed wanderers, barred from returning home until they could find a sorceress powerful enough to wash the blood of a brother from their hands. The quest for glory had officially ended. The desperate struggle for redemption had begun. The Argo was no longer a vessel of glory. It was a floating hearse carrying a heavy burden of guilt. Since the brutal murder of Prince Apsyrtus, the winds had driven them aimlessly across the Mediterranean. The timber of the ship had fallen silent, refusing to offer counsel to the food rotted, and the water turned stale. The crew moved like ghosts, knowing they were carrying a spiritual infection known as miasma. To return home, they needed more than a map. They needed a priestess capable of washing blood from the soul. Guided by the desperate instincts of Medea, they arrived at the island of Ea. The air here was thick with magic. Wolves and lions wandered the beaches, but they did not attack. They fawned like house dogs, staring with eyes that looked unsettlingly human. This was the domain of Circe, the daughter of the sun and the aunt of Medea. She was an immortal sorceress of terrifying power, a woman who wove the fates of men on a great loom. Jason and Medea approached her palace in silence, kneeling at the hearth in the posture of silence. They did not speak. 4 murderers were forbidden to speak until cleansed. Circe, recognizing the dark aura of her niece, understood immediately what had happened. With a grim expression, she performed the ancient rites of purification. She slit the throat of a suckling pig, letting the blood wash over their hands to rinse away the gore of Apsyrtus, and burned cakes and libations to appease the Furies. The ritual broke the curse, but it did not by her favor. Once the rite was done, Circe looked at Jason with cold eyes. "I have made you clean before the gods," she declared, "but I cannot make you clean before yourself. You leave this island at once. I will not shelter those who kill their own blood. cast out once again. The Argonauts sailed toward the next perilous danger that could not be fought with swords. They approached the island of Anthemasa, the home of the Sirens. These were bird women with the faces of maidens, sitting atop a cliff white with the bleached bones of sailors. Their weapon was not force, but knowledge. They sang a song that promised the listener exactly what they most desired: wisdom, rest, and the cessation of all pain. To hear it was to be compelled to jump into the sea and swim to them, only to be dashed against the jagged rocks. As the faint melody began to drift across the water, the crew's eyes glazed over. Men who had faced dragons and armies began to drop their oars. They stood up, entranced, walking toward the gunwales, ready to throw themselves into the deep. Jason shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the supernatural beauty of the siren's call. The Argo began to drift toward the reefs. This was the moment for Orpheus, the legendary musician who had sat quietly for most of the voyage, climbed onto the poop deck. He did not shout, he played. He struck his lyre, summoning a melody of such piercing clarity and divine order that it cut through the hypnotic haze of the sirens. It was a musical duel between the chaotic, seductive forces of nature and the disciplined, civilized beauty of human art. Orpheus sang of the creation of the world, of the birth of the stars, and of the order of Olympus. His song was louder, purer, and stronger. Slowly, the Argonauts shook their heads, waking from the trance. They grabbed their oars and rowed in rhythm to Orpheus's beat, driving the ship away from the deadly rocks. The sirens, defeated by a superior artist, shrieked in frustration and threw themselves into the sea. For it was their fate to die if a ship ever passed them unharmed. Only one Argonaut, Butes, was lost, overcome by the desire. He jumped before Orpheus could save him. The rest survived. They had been cleansed by blood and saved by song. The monsters were behind them. Now, only the politics of men remained. After months of battling monsters, defying gods, and navigating the edges of the map, the Argo finally slid onto the sands of Io. The hull was scarred, the sails were patched, and the heroes were aged beyond their years. Jason stepped onto his native soil holding the Golden Fleece, the prize that was promised to buy back his kingdom. He marched to the palace gates, expecting a coronation. Instead, he found a fortress closed against him. King Pelias, the man who had sent him to die, looked down from the high walls. He was older now, frail and trembling, but his grip on power was as tight as ever. When Jason displayed the shining fleece, Pelias simply laughed. "You have brought me a rug," the king sneered. "But I still hold the crown. Do you think a piece of wool makes you a king?" The betrayal was absolute. Not only did Pelias refuse to step down, but news reached Jason that during his absence, Pelias had driven Jason's father Aeson to suicide, believing the Argo had been lost at sea. Jason stood at the gates with 50 heroes, but he knew he could not take the city by force. The walls were high, and the guards were loyal. Despair threatened to crush him, until Medea stepped forward. She placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered words that would seal their doom. "Leave the army here. I will take the city without drawing a sword." Medea's weapon was not steel. It was hope. She disguised herself as an old priestess of Artemis and entered the city, claiming to bring blessings from the goddess. She gained access to the private chambers of the palace, where she befriended the daughters of Pelias. These women loved their father deeply, but watched with sorrow as he grew senile and weak. Medea planted a seed of seduction in their minds. She claimed she possessed the secret of the gods, the power to reverse aging. She told them she could boil the years out of a body and restore the vigor of youth. To prove her claim, she staged a piece of theater that was both miraculous and grotesque. She ordered a cauldron of water to be brought to a boil over a roaring fire. She took an old, decrepit, rambled and limping gun, slit its throat, tossing the carcass into the bubbling water. She added strange herbs and chanted an incantation. Moments later, a bleeding sound echoed from the pot. A young lamb, vibrant and strong, leaped out of the steam. The daughters were mesmerized. They saw a miracle. They did not see the sleight of hand, nor the dark intent. That night, convinced by the witch, the daughters of Pelias led their father into the ritual chamber. They believed they were saving him. Medea instructed them that for the magic to work, the old blood must be drained. With trembling hands, doing what they thought was an act of love, The daughters took knives and cut their own father to pieces. They threw the mangled remains of the king into the boiling cauldron. They turned to Medea, waiting for the herbs, waiting for the chant. But Medea stood silent. She did not throw in the magical roots. She did not sing the song of life. She simply watched with a cold, terrifying smile as the water turned red and the body of the usurper boiled into soup. The Peliades screamed as the realization washed over them they had not rejuvenated their father. They had cooked him. When Jason entered the city the next morning, the gates were open, not because he was welcomed, but because the city was in shock. The prophecy of the one sandal had been fulfilled in the most horrific way possible. Pelias was dead, but the victory was hollow. The people of Iolcos looked at Jason and Medea not as liberators, but as butchers. The council of the city, disgusted by the sorcery and patricide, exiled them both. Jason had won the fleece and killed the king, but he had lost his home forever. He walked away from the throne he had spent his life chasing, holding the hand of a woman whose love was becoming more dangerous than her hate. Jason has finally taken his revenge, but at a cost that no hero should have to pay. Do you think Medea went too far? Or did Pelias deserve his gruesome fate? Let me know your verdict in the comments. Below, I read every single one. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the darker side of Greek mythology, please subscribe and hit the bell icon. You do not want to miss the next episode, where the love story of Jason and Medea turns into the most famous divorce and massacre in history. The real tragedy is just beginning. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter.